While most people who have seen the Black Panther loved it, and rightfully so, it's a legit awesome film, there's a small but very vocal group who want to say it's not important because we've had black superheroes in film before. This is true, but there is a reason why Black Panther matters. I'm Mr. Divery, and this is One Geek's Opinion. Black people in sci-fi fantasy haven't always had the best relationship. During what's considered the golden age of comics, every hero made World War II an important part of their story. Some of the greatest heroes were created during World War II. Others created at that time were not so great. This is Whitewash Jones. Do I have to explain the problem here, or can we all just see it? This is one of the earliest depictions of a black person in a superhero comic book. He was a member of the teen sidekick team known as the Young Allies, a horrible caricature that sadly reflects how and what black people were thought to be, even as they were dying for the freedom of others around the world while being denied it in their own home. When you look at what we have today, you cannot forget where we came from. Whitewash Jones was retconned into Washington Jones in 2009, when Marvel did a 70th anniversary of the Young Allies, where all their exploits were said to have been the real-world adventures of a special ops unit, but turned into silly comics. And of all the things the Young Allies objected to, the depiction of Jones was the worst offender. Yeah, I agree. After Jones in the 1950s, we get Waku, the Prince of Bantu. This was the first real step towards a positive depiction of a black person in a comic book. He was something of the Black Panther before there was a Black Panther, except he wasn't a superhero, he didn't have powers or advanced technology. He was just a jungle hero leading a tribe. This is the rare case of the jungle hero actually being black. The small problem is Waku was not the star of his own comic. He was part of an anthology tale that also comprised a white man hunter, a white female animal trainer, and some random stories about animals in the wild. It was nice Waku was the star of his stories and a positive depiction of African culture in the 1950s no less, but it is disappointing he couldn't even get his own comic book. In the mid-60s, we get our first black character to star in his own comic book, Lobo. No, not that guy, but this guy. Lobo the Gunslinger, printed by Dell Comics. It didn't sell well, largely because of the exact reason you might think. It's not that people weren't buying the book. A lot of the boxes were returned to Dell Comics unopened. Sellers weren't crazy about the idea of a black Western hero. They printed 200,000 issues, but sold less than 20,000. So, even though Lobo was the first African American character to star in his own comic book, it was clear America was not ready for it. And that was the end of that. Until a year later, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby introduced a new character into the Fantastic Four, the Black Panther. The Black Panther was a breakthrough in the depiction of black people in superhero comic books. He was as smart as Reed Richards, as good a fighter as Captain America, as rich as Batman, and had the technological advances of Iron Man. But for all he had, it would be a decade before he could star in his own comic book. He would spend years guest starring and sidekicking in other people's books. But then, in 1973, he became the star of Jungle Action. But sadly, he was a year too late to be the first black superhero to star in his own comic book. That honor would go to none other than Luke Cage. Oh, you think you know Luke Cage. He's great, right? Well, truthfully, he's a big part of the problems black characters in the genre have tried to overcome. Luke Cage was originally a jive-talking hero for hire based on the blaxploitation film genre, which to this day is viewed as controversial at best, and while Luke Cage was drawn pretty well himself, some of his villains were only one or two bad choices away from being Whitewash Jones's relatives. Don't get me wrong, Luke Cage has come a long way. I love the current Luke Cage, and even the older version of Luke Cage has a certain charm. But it's important to note that a character who would fight Dr. Doom because he owed him $200 was the first black superhero to star in his own comic book. We didn't see too many more black characters in starring roles in the 70s and 80s, but we saw more and more black supporting characters. Of course Storm, but also James Rhodes and Jon Stewart, who at times would take up the mantle of Iron Man and Green Lantern respectively. Falcon, who became Captain America's main supporting character, who wasn't a love interest. Or was he? You also had mentor-type characters like Robbie Robertson and Lucius Fox. These characters would show what would be the role of black people in comic books for most of the rest of the 20th century. Supporting characters and teammates, but they would rarely be the driving force in a book. This unceremoniously changed for a short period of time in the 1990s with Milestone Media, created by Dwayne McDuffie, Denz Cowan, Michael Davis, and Derek T. Dingle, who created their own superhero universe populated by black superheroes such as Hardware, Icon, and the Blood Syndicate. This was a milestone, however short-lived, and a chance for writers and artists of color to tell the stories that reflected their culture and ideas, including the creation of Buck Wild, a self-proclaimed hero for rent who spoke in jive talk and was an embarrassment to the rest of the Milestone heroes. Yeah, not pulling any punches, this was a response to Luke Cage. But even though Milestone Comics eventually disappeared, a few of their characters are still around. Most notably, a character you probably know best as Static Shock. Static was one of the first mainstream cartoons about a black superhero. Static addressed concepts like race, identity, gang violence, and other social issues while maintaining its fun and humor for a preteen audience, even winning several awards including a Daytime Emmy. Yet another milestone for Milestone. We did see black superheroes in films, like Spawn and Steel, and especially Blade. Blade being seen by many as a spark that led to the whole modern version of comic books being turned into movies that we see today. And it was a great step forward that even before Spider-Man got his first film, Blade starred in a series of films. But Blade had no real cultural importance to being black or even being a superhero. He was a vampire hunter. Now, if you want to talk about Blade's impact on characters like Buffy and Angel, Supernatural, and the rest, sure. And it's nice that him being black wasn't a big deal. But it wasn't a big deal. Which brings us full circle. With the guy who was once a joke breaking the internet. Luke Cage. After about a 10-year revamp, the character makes it to live action where he honors his past but moves beyond it. To being a sense-talking, morally righteous, modern-day hood hero that's more hero than hood. Where his 70s version was a collection of many negative stereotypes of African Americans, the modern-day Cage is a collection of street philosophers trying to teach the next generation to honor the traditions and dignity of the heroes who came before. Really didn't expect Marvel to be able to top that. But then comes Black Panther, and why it matters. It takes African culture and weaves it into its own mythology. There's actually no need for this to be part of the MCU. It's deep and rich enough to have its own cinematic universe. And that's why it matters. We can have more than just black characters who are respectable heroes and role models. We can create whole film universes that are inspired by black and African culture. It matters because using culture as an inspiration for science fiction and fantasy is no longer limited to just European culture. Everyone can play. Every society can have their version of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. And everyone can enjoy it. Not just black people enjoying black stuff, but we can all take pride in including everyone and being included with everyone. And that's why Black Panther matters. As always, I'm Mr. Divery, and that was One Geek's Opinion.